Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing today? This video will be, about death, about the loss of a parent, about the loss of a loved one. It can go down many different roads and have many facets to it, but namely, to get it right up front here, what I'm talking about is the death of a parent as a teenager and how it shapes us and affects us as adults. I lost my father when I was 15, I believe. It's either 14 or 15. It's hard to recall because a lot of that was blocked out rather. And at the time, I was living with my father, and my younger brother, who was 3 years younger than me, was living with my mother, who just lived, across the river a ways. And we moved into a little town called Lake Oswego, near Portland. And it was kind of a yuppie town. It's considered kind of the rich area, but we were poor as poor could be. We lived in what they called the First Edition, downtown Lake Oswego. So it was like these little small houses, like an 800 square foot house, I think. And we paid, I think, $425 a month for it. And my father worked for the post office, and at the time, when he got sick, he was as stubborn as I am. I mean, I don't know my father because all I know is the stories I've heard about him and the way I can recall his life, as according to a young kid. And when I was about 13, he got cancer, and gradually he got worse and worse until he died. But this was during a time while he was dying when I became a skateboarder. My whole thing was to just try to escape it all, and I wasn't even there in the hospital when he died, even though I probably knew he was going to die. So, I don't want to get too much into the story of it, but just to give a little background to see where I'm coming from now. During that time, I blocked a lot of my life out, and after that as well. My teen years, not only do my teen years have a lot of missing links, I mean, I remember generally the things I did, but I talked to a lot of people who remember their childhood very detailed. And I remember moments. I remember stinging my foot when I was 5. And I'm actually planning to write my biography, just for myself, not to publish, but I want to take notes of everything I can remember about my life, so I can slowly fill in maybe parts that, as I remember them, just for the sake of figuring out how I became who I am. Just a sec. Kids, sorry. Actually, I'm glad he walked out because it reminded me to mention that I'm at the age now that my father was when he passed away. He was about 42, I think, and I'm 41, and I'll be 42 this November. So perhaps this is why it comes so full circle. A lot of people who reach the age of their parents' death say, "Oh, I made it past," Well, what I was saying about my childhood is remembering these specific moments when I was young, but I don't really recall much of it. I know we moved around a lot, and that affected me too. My parents were divorced when I was 12, and the funny thing is that a couple decades passed before I even realized that I was affected by it. Because as a human being, we're in denial about a lot of things. As a human that doesn't seek to understand themselves or learn about psychology, we're not likely to see how our attitudes are affected by our past. Now, I'm a very warm person. I have emotions. I care about people. But I also have a hard and a blunt side. I can be a little rough around the edges, and I don't put up with bullshit from people, I'm as cool can be with people until they cross me, and then I just say, fuck you. And that's how I've always been. But I know that partially I want to know why I'm that way, and why I'm, why I'd had anxiety. I'd never really had depression, but there were times when I went through bouts of, say, they would call it acute depression, I guess. And it doesn't last that long, but there were times when I laid on the couch for a week when I was later in my teen years. I think actually when I was about 18 or 19, I remember sitting on the couch for a week thinking that nobody liked me. Because my younger brother he was kind of a punk ass, and he'd always tell my friends, lies about me and take my stuff and give it to my friends. He was trying to be with, hang out with the older crew, and I felt like I was like nobody liked me for some reason. Once I got back and talked to people, I realized it was all in my head, and maybe it was kind of a realization at that point that I was creating my own hell. But the point is that it wasn't very long lasting. And it wasn't until my late 20s when I started to really experience anxiety. And I had anxiety until I was in my early to mid 30s, and it wasn't anything I considered. I figured this was just normal. This is just how people are. People stress out. I went to the doctor. I tried to get a prescription for Valium. He gave me Klonopin, and that was only for like a month or so. And I realized I don't want to be addicted to benzodiazepines. I don't want to take anxiolytics to try to relax. There's got to be a natural way to get over this. And that was when I started when I really started reading a lot about psychology, because up to that point I'd been into conspiracies. I was into figuring out what was going on with the New World Order, or when, martial law would be declared. And in retrospect, I realized that falling into that conspiracy trap is something we do when we're unhappy with our own lives. Generally, a person who's doing really well and has a lot of companionship and loved ones around them, they don't spend a lot of time complaining about conspiracies. Not to say that there aren't conspiracies, but I'm saying there's a certain type of mentality that gravitates towards obsessing over them and always blaming the other person. And it comes back to being, hold on a sec, I'm being summoned. Sorry about that. Whoa. Maybe I'll try to edit that out. Or maybe not. So, where was I? As an adult now, seeing things from a different perspective, I realized that I was more affected by these things that happened to me in my childhood than I realized. And it wasn't until I started to understand imprinting a little better, as well as reading psychology books a few years back. And I'll tell you something about psychology. I think that everybody should read a little bit of psychology and understand what the viewpoint of a psychiatrist or psychologist is, and see what they think of people. And you'll quickly realize that a lot of folks see people as personality types, and that's very unhelpful. It can be useful sometimes. It's easy to read into what people are saying, or their body language, or different things to try to assume what they're really thinking. But there's a much deeper complexity to who we are. I like to say there's three selves. There's the self that others see, the self that we think we are, and then the self that we really, truly feel inside. Usually the last two are cognitive dissonance, separating them. What we really want to believe versus what we do believe or think we believe. But off track there. Anyhow, psychiatry and learning a little bit, one thing I did learn is don't go too far into it. Don't read too far into this. I basically shut the book halfway through, the last one I was reading, because I didn't want to start making assumptions based on what I'd read from somebody else's, it's a very tenable trade at best, because, a lot of people will tell you if you lose a parent, go to therapy. You'll read an article and it'll say the most important thing for a kid who loses a parent is, to go see somebody. But if you actually ask people who lost a parent, they'll tell you that it was one of the least useful things that they did was seeing a therapist or a counselor. That the most useful things were looking at photos, listening to music, making a connection, and, really mourning, and the hardest thing for mourning about a lost parent is that it might take a couple of years. I didn't cry when my father died, and I didn't cry at his funeral. It wasn't until months later. I was listening to the radio, and Nights in White Satin came on by the Moody Blues. My father loved the Moody Blues, and it was a song that I remember him by, and from that time on, every time I hear that song, it reminds me of him. And so, each person's going to deal with grief in their own way. And not everybody's going to be able to, not everybody's going to take the time to ask themselves why and how their childhood affected them now as an adult. But I think that it's very important that we all do. And my experience was losing a father, and that was at age 15. For you, it could have been losing a mother at age 6, or even at 30 or 40. Everybody's going to lose their parents or their children or somebody in their lives, and that's just the life we live. But when it hits you at a crucial point in your teenage years, you're not prepared for those things. And so what it can do is, the question is, does it, for a son, losing his father as a teenager, generally, you know, people who are in prison, they say that men in prison are 3 times more likely to have lost a parent when they were young. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because a person lost a parent, they're going to be a criminal. But what it can mean is some people can take a lot more chances, they may take risks, they may rebel and say, I'm not going to put up with this world, I'm going to take what I want, however we react to it. Others may just break down and give up. But what they found is that a majority of people who are in the top of their class, as far as what they do for, you know, employment or a living, really successful people tend to have lost a parent when they were younger. And this isn't consistently proven, but the idea is whether or not maybe for some people it makes them much stronger, makes them more resilient, and they have to prove themselves. Perhaps it's partially because we're distracting ourselves from the pain by working harder. But I think it really depends on the individual, the situation they've been in, and their state of mind. So overall, I guess I'll just end this here. I just wanted to say to anyone else who's lost a parent, you know, sometimes there are things we don't realize about ourselves that are affected by that. And by understanding our past and the big things that happened, we can start to understand ourselves better, and hopefully that improves our lives. So, peace. I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks for watching. If you got any questions, the info's in the description and all that stuff like always, so talk to you later.